Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about the Twilight Zone Season 5 episode 35. It's called The Fear. It is the penultimate episode of both the season and also the entire series of the Twilight Zone. So kind of exciting to wrapping it up. This had a cool sounding premise when we read it at the end of the last episode. It is a two-person story. With a state trooper and a woman who's living in a cabin kind of in the middle of nowhere. I mean, near a small town, but kind of secluded from it. And the episode begins with the state trooper coming up to check on her because he heard that the woman had been saying something to some of the locals about seeing some lights in the sky, possibly UFO stuff. But that's kind of how the story starts. Charlotte is the name of the lady, and the state trooper is named Franklin. So, yeah, this one's pretty fun. It's not like a super special episode. It doesn't necessarily reinvent the wheel or do something super shocking, but it has a nice simple premise where the characters are seeing evidence of strange things happen. And as the episode goes on, it starts to imply that whatever is out there, if it's an alien or something, that it's very big, that it's a giant of some kind. And that was something that we kind of read last time, although I'd forgotten about it, to be honest. I always forget what I read at the end of the last episode by the time that I'm actually watching the next one. But yeah, I think what works about it is it's a fun thing to tease when they start dropping hints that there are these giants of some, or at least one giant. Such as the big fingerprints on the car that are like, I don't know, like 2 foot tall fingerprints. Once that stuff starts coming in, that is kind of fun. It makes it a little bit different to other stories that we've had in the show where it's like characters hiding in a room or a house or something like that. Because we've definitely had similar premise in that sense. But I think what makes it work though and just brings it all together is that both characters are fairly well defined. They kind of like bounce off of each other quite well, where at the start of the episode, Charlotte is this woman who, by the sounds of it, had a really hoity-toity job. She worked at like a fashion magazine or something like that, and she had a nervous breakdown, and she, to relax and try and like get her inner peace or whatever, has moved to the country and moved out here to try and get away from everyone for the stress. But she clearly is still a bit of a snob. She made a lot of money before. She talks about, you know, earning enough in a year to buy the entire town that's nearby. And quite quickly that rubs the state trooper the wrong way a little bit, and he kind of points out that she's a complete snob. So it starts them off in this place of conflict. But as they're put through the motions and they're put through the story of the episode, they kind of earn a little bit of respect for each other, and they realize that they're not just the two-dimensional archetypes that they kind of assumed each other were at the start of the story. And it's not a romance. I mean, it could turn into one, I suppose, but they don't really hint at that or anything like that. They don't do any kind of like loving eyes at each other. It's more just this idea that they have these preconceptions of each other, and once stuff starts happening, once the fear, the title of the episode, kicks in, it forces them to be a little bit honest. You know, when the first scary thing happens, which is these big lights that are outside, she kind of opens up a little bit and admits that, okay, you know what? Yeah, I am a bit of a snob, but it's kind of just a defense mechanism to try and make it look like I'm not scared, right? It's just like, it's trying to make me look like I'm in a position of power. I'm in a position of control because I'm shit terrified. And he responds, oh, I appreciate the honest answer to that question. And likewise, when he finds the big fingerprints on the cop car just before the ad break, and he comes in and he opens up about how he's scared, because she's still talking about how she's a scaredy cat, and he's like, hey, look, I've been in 2 wars, I've been a police officer like between those wars and since the last war, and I have spent more time than most feeling scared. I've been in more situations feeling scared than most average people will ever encounter. So trust me, fear is just something you have to sort of like take care of. But you know, it's like he's opening up, he's sharing, and she kind of responds to it. For an episode that's really just a fun gimmick of a story, especially when you get to the end and they pull their Twilight Zone swerve at the end, it's actually quite impressive how much thought they put into the characters. And it's not even that deep, really. It's really quite simple. It's just, you know, they start off not liking each other. They've got legitimate reasons not to like each other. and then they kind of open up a little bit as the episode goes on. Honestly, if I have any real critiques, it's maybe just that there is a little bit of time being killed early on when he's looking through the forest with a torch, and he's just kind of looking to see if there's anything out there. That takes up, like, I don't know, 3 minutes of screen time, and that's quite a lot in a 25-minute Twilight Zone episode. It kind of just felt like, oh, this is, I don't want to say padding, because it is supposed to be suspenseful, but it doesn't really feel like anything meaningful is really happening as of yet. But once the big hints, no pun intended, start hitting, it's pretty enjoyable. Right? Again, not a super standout episode, not one that you're going to list in the top 10 of the entire show or anything like that, but a fun sort of horror sci-fi premise that goes in an interesting direction. And I think the big tease at the end of the first half, right before the ad break, is him saying, hey, whatever left those fingerprints on that car would have to be like 500 foot tall based on the fingerprint size. And that's what it goes to the cliffhanger on. And that's a good ad break cliffhanger. You know, it's something I always bring up when I'm talking about these episodes, how sometimes the cliffhanger for the ad break just feels like a non-event. No, that's a big deal. Like actually saying that out loud, that we're dealing with something that's that big, even though visually it was kind of clear already, like having him actually say that out loud does feel like a big deal. Once we get into the second half of the episode, and they're kind of waiting overnight, they're scared, they don't really know what to do. And it's actually just as they find, or maybe it's just before they find the giant footprint when they go out looking in the morning. They see this big footprint, and she starts to freak out, and she starts to run through the woods. And I actually, at this point in the episode, started to think to myself, okay, obviously, it's a 1965 episode of The Twilight Zone, or 1964 episode. I'm not expecting anything too, much in terms of like some great visual effect later on. But because they're teasing it so hard, I'm like, they're going to show me something. They're going to show me something resembling a giant. And it wouldn't even be the first time this season. Remember, there was that episode earlier this season with the couple in the town that turned out to be the little girl's like sort of playhouse or whatever. And that kind of did like an effect where someone was much bigger than the other two. So I know it's possible, but I was kind of like sitting thinking, oh, I wonder how much they're going to actually try and visually show at the end when they really kind of like reveal this off. Or are they going to, play it a little bit more mysterious, let the what you don't see kind of do a lot of the work. But no, it's actually like maybe 30 seconds later, like right after I had that thought. Admittedly, by the time they're looking at the footprint and she's running through the forest, I didn't realize that we only had 5 minutes left. So by that point, we're ready for whatever the big payoff to this is going to be. And yeah, they do an extra swerve here where, like she stumbles out of the forest, she falls to the ground, and she looks up and screams. And then the trooper comes running out, and he looks up, and we get this big shot of seemingly a giant alien, a humanoid alien, but with one big eye. So a very sort of generic, monstrous looking alien in a spacesuit. That is, I mean, I don't know if it's quite 500 foot tall, but certainly a couple of 100 foot tall. Really big. They're doing a bit of, perspective trickery here. They're doing a little bit of, I think the map painted on, like the background to the, not painted, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, the effectively green screen before, I think we were using that term, but they do some trickery. It kind of works. There's some minor nitpicks. Like I did think to myself, like, wait a minute, what? And this isn't a real nitpick because it's explained in a minute. But in the moment, I was thinking, oh, why was it leaving fingerprints? Because it looks like it's got gloves on. And also, the sort of broad thing you could say about the story is that how has this thing not been seen yet? Like, we keep getting these hints of these big footprints and these big fingerprints. Like this thing, like think of the T-Rex in Jurassic Park. Surely the reverberations of the footsteps, the tremors you might get from that would be something to be constantly noticing. And again, that's not actually a mistake. It makes sense once we get the sort of the last bit of the twist. So what it turns out here is the trooper has this big standoff moment where he's like, you go to town and try and get help. I'm going to hold him off with this pistol, even though it's like a pea shooter going after a bomber. Yeah, I can make some jokes here about typical American, we'll just shoot first and ask questions later. But he fires some shots off at this big, giant alien, and then it seems like they're getting hit with a lot of wind, And then it turns out that this giant alien was inflatable. It was not real, right? And the air coming out of it like hits them like a big gust of wind, and then it falls on top of them, and they come crawling out from underneath, and like, it was a balloon. What the hell's going on? And then they find a tiny spaceship. The episode ends with a tiny UFO. And when I say tiny, it's not like it's about as big as like a wagon wheel, say, right? But tiny and, you know, relative to what an actual UFO that could fit humanoid-sized beings in it would be. And the joke of it, and as a joke, right, the end of the episode is that the aliens are actually much, much smaller, right? They look like the big one did, but they're much smaller, and they're in this tiny, tiny ship. It's very... I mean, arguably it is maybe a little too similar to that season 2 episode with the woman who was on her own in the house, and the alien at the end turned out to be just a tiny, tiny person, or a tiny, tiny alien. So it's kind of like that, but here it's played in a very different way, where you hear them talking to each other, and the aliens basically say, yeah, we planted the fingerprints, and we planted the footprint, but it wasn't enough to scare the humans, so we can't take over Earth. Abort, abort. And I don't even think they say they can't take over. I think they just say the test failed, right? They were testing to see if they could scare us because we're bigger than they are, and they fly off at the end. But that's why all those things I was questioning in my head before this point ended up being answered, because it was a prank, effectively. Like, I think they mentioned briefly that they use magnets to flip the car over and things like that. They were using tricks to make it look like some sort of giant being was around. That's the part that feels unique here, right? The fact that they turn out to be tiny aliens, they've kind of done that before in the show. But the idea that they're fabricating fear, or trying to at the very least, by playing tricks and illusions is kind of interesting. It's a little bit different. So I like that. I actually think it's a fun little ending to the episode. And it, you know, they beat you over the head with the message a little bit at the end, which is, oh, we overcame our fear, and it turns out that fear itself was the thing to, you know, the only thing to fear is fear itself. Like, Rod basically says that in his ending narration as he's saying goodbye, which is fine. Like, you know, it's obviously the subversion that they think there's a giant alien, but it turns out they're tiny, and we're the giants compared to them. And the main character even says as they're flying off, you know what, I wish them luck. I wish them that the next place they go to, they find someone of a comparable size, so it's a fair fight, or something to that effect. And then Rod Serling also says something about how, you know, fear is very relative to like who can step on who, kind of thing. Like, I mean, it's all a bit, you know, over-explainy with the ending narration, as it sometimes is. Sometimes he's a bit more vague. Sometimes he's like really, really hitting you over the head with it. And I think this is one where he's hitting you over the head with it. But it doesn't diminish that it was a fun reveal. That it was all fabricated, and it plays into this idea that the episode was about them being scared and admitting to each other they were being scared, which was a nice bit of character bonding. And then you have this at the end just to sort of give you a fun kind of like ending more than anything. So I don't think it's got like a great deep message like some Twilight Zone episodes do. It's pretty simple, generic, you know, overcoming fear stuff for the most part. But the characters bonding give it a little bit of nice kind of, you know, like the characters are good enough to carry you throughout the story, to care about them a little bit and see some growth in both of them. And then the actual reveal at the end is a nice sort of whip around in terms of what you were expecting. So yeah, it's a fun episode. It's a fun, solid episode to kind of, you know, as we get towards the end of the show here. I should probably mention that the actors here as well, because I did recognize both of them. Hazel Court, who plays the woman, she has been in a few of like the Vincent Price movies, you know, the Vincent Price and Roger Corman movies, like The Raven, like we did recently on Screams After Midnight, and she's in that. So I instantly recognized her and went, what do I know her from? And that's what it turned out to be. But she's in a lot of movies in the 50s, 60s. So she's just kind of from that era. The actor, funnily enough, I did not recognize from this particular era. I recognized him from something much later. He is a character in Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, a movie that I am overly defensive about. It's not a good movie by any means, but I have a lot of fun with it. He plays like kind of mean uncle in that movie. But I recognized him from that. I was like, hey, I know him from something. What is it? And as soon as I saw Friday the 13th 8, which showed up in IMDb as his like most known for role, which is a bit of a shame. But I was like, oh yeah, I know exactly who he is now. So yeah, just worth mentioning that both these actors stuck out to me in one way or another. But yeah, fun episode. Had a good time with it. I think the teases of what's going on. Like, I think before the giant fingerprints, it was okay and the characters were decent enough to keep it kind of going. But once the fingerprints showed up, it was like, oh, this is the unique thing for this. This is like the fact that they're giant is the fun kind of tease. Especially if, I mean, I imagine watching this episode as a first, like, if you've never seen an episode of Twilight Zone versus having watched like the entire show basically by now, you have a slightly different reaction to it. But I think it does do a good job of having some fresh elements mixed in with what feels like more typical stuff to make it interesting to even, you know, me and anyone who's been on this whole journey. So, cool. Rod does come on at the end and tells us about next week's episode. It says something about... What did he say? Something about kids? He talked about kids? Or something? I don't know. Let's just read the description at IMDb rather than me try to remember what he said. It's called the Bewitching Pool. Oh yeah, it's about a swimming pool. Oh god, this better not be like Night Swim that came out earlier this year. That movie was pretty not good. Here's the description. 2 children escape their bickering parents through a portal in the bottom of their swimming pool to a magical land watched over by a kind old woman the children call Aunt T. Okay. I get it. Aunt T. Auntie. Aunt T. I get what they're doing there. Is this going to be a... Obviously it's a little bit bed knobs and broomsticks or Narnia or whatever you want to call it. I'm wondering, what's the mythological... Like the evil witch lady who steals kids. What's that? Is that the Baba Yaga? Is that what that is? Although now I'm thinking of John Wick because they call him that and that, which is making me doubt that. I don't know, but like, you probably know what I'm talking about. Is this going to be like that, where this aunt turns out to be an evil woman who's stealing the kids or something? That's my initial thought as I read that, but we'll find out in the final ever episode of the original Twilight Zone next time. It won't be the last video I do. Obviously, I'll come back and do my top 5 or maybe even top 10 of the season after that as well. But we have one more actual episode left, and that's what we're doing next time. If you haven't been checking it out, I've already started doing the 1980s version of Twilight Zone. It's a Patreon-sponsored review, but it's available for everyone, doing 2 of those episodes a month. So I've done like 5 or 6 of those so far. Or maybe even 7 now, actually. I don't know. I've lost count. But that's going well. There's been some great episodes in there so far. There's been some really bad episodes as well. Really up and down, but that's kind of normal for an anthology show. So yeah, we'll see how this does next week. Thank you very much for joining me. You can support all the content via patreon.com/MailFuzzTV or via YouTube membership if that's more your thing. Patreon, though, you get to support both channels and you get the bonus content from both channels. So if that's something you're interested in, there's a sci-fi movie podcast over on the movie channel called The Atomic Cinema Experiment, which might be of interest if since you're here for a sci-fi show. But any help is appreciated. It's what helps keep everything going and keeps all the reviews coming across both channels. So thank you very much for joining me. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV in the Twilight Zone.